With that, I'm going to turn things over to Tommy. Thank you all so much for attending. Please enjoy the presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Happy to be here. I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar, the use of formative assessments in legal education, or in other words, how to address ABA Standard 314 regarding assessments. I suppose you've logged in today because either you've been enticed by this webinar description or that you're really scared about the new ABA standards, or potentially both. And regarding the ABA standards, it can be a bit scary because it is vastly different from what some of us may be used to, because as law faculty, we are so used to conducting classes in the same way that we were taught. And I graduated law school in the 90s, and certainly many times the assessments in my class consisted of only one 3-hour or 4-hour exam. And so with the new ABA standards, that obviously has been changed. So let's talk about some of the objectives that I hope to be able to discuss today. Explain the new ABA standards regarding the learning outcomes and assessments. I'm going to talk about the different kinds of assessments contemplated by the new ABA standards. Finally, I'm going to illustrate how using ExamSoft can assist with assessment, evaluation, and decision-making, and specifically keeping up with some of the new ABA standards that we're talking about. But before we begin, I think it's important to sort of examine the law school landscape and sort of understand sort of what the law school landscape is regarding assessment in comparison to maybe some of the other disciplines. The ABA standards on learning outcomes and assessments, they're certainly new from sort of the legal education perspective, but it's not new in general. Legal education, as some of you know, is generally anywhere from 10, 20, sometimes 25, 30 years behind other disciplines like engineering, nursing, and education, where in those disciplines they've been using effectively learning outcomes and assessments. And that's good and bad for us in legal education. I mean, it's certainly good that these other disciplines have had experience effectively using learning outcomes and assessments, because we have other disciplines to draw on, and we're able to sort of understand some of their successes and failures. Moreover, because of some of these other disciplines and programs have embraced learning outcomes and assessments, we can certainly rely on their expertise and other programs within the university and even the university assessment office to help with the law school's own assessment efforts. Now, the bad part, though, is that because it's relatively new in legal education, while it's good that we can look at other disciplines, the bad news is also that we have to look at other disciplines. We don't necessarily have other law schools to draw upon, or at least from a wide-scale comparison. So sometimes, while we can look to other disciplines, it's not exactly completely relevant. It's not exactly the same thing. But the good news is that because other disciplines have been doing that, we're not exactly reinventing the wheel when it comes to learning outcomes and assessments. The wheel still rolls. The wheel is still around. However, the terrain over which the wheel travels might be a little different. So let's specifically look at some of the new ABA standards, specifically dealing with learning outcomes and assessments. And there's three major ones: standards 302, 314, and 315. And as the title of this webinar suggests, what we're going to focus on is standard 314, but we can't really talk about 314, assessment of student learning, without really talking about 302, learning outcomes. So it's important to know that while these are new standards, the application of these standards won't actually begin until the 2016-17 academic year. But you do need to start thinking about these standards now, just because with any meaningful change takes time. So now's the time to think about it. Now's the time to start making changes. Now's the time to start implementing things. So specifically, the timeline for implementation for these assessment standards, application of the standards will begin with the 16-17 academic year. However, if you're at one of the law schools with an upcoming site visit this academic year, schools with 15-16 site visits should be prepared to report on how they are working to come into compliance with what the standards require. In doing so, schools have to show that they are, quote, seriously engaged in the work that is necessary to develop and adopt learning outcomes and to develop and adopt an assessment program. Now, this is language taken from the guidance memo from the ABA in discussing these standards, and so the language seriously engaged is in that there's no further explanation as to what seriously engaged in, but it certainly represents a marked departure than what is probably generally done by most law schools. So let's look at the overview of the assessment program. When I talk about the assessment program, really what I'm talking about is the methodology of assuring that outcome measures and assessments that law schools develop will improve their legal education programs and better serve the needs of students in law school and subsequently in their professional careers. And so the assessment program is very student-centric. It really focuses on student learning and also the students' professional careers. And when I think of the assessment program, I sort of divide that into three major areas. Sort of the information gathering area, which is sort of the actual assessment program, or excuse me, the assessment component. That's where you're gathering data. That's where you're actually doing whether it's formative assessments or summative assessments. Then the second part is using that data. Once the data is gathered, then you evaluate or assess the student's performance. And once you've assessed the student's performance, then you actually make some programmatic changes or some curricular changes based on that. So when you think of assessment, assessment is really just one component of a larger assessment program. And I know one of the things that sometimes we've been guilty here is simply just doing assessments for the sake of assessment. But really what you want to ensure that you're doing is using the information gathered from the assessments to make some meaningful changes in order to improve student learning, sort of thinking about closing the gap. Okay. So that's the overview of the assessment program. Now let's specifically talk about the relevant ABA standards. And we begin with standard 302, learning outcomes. A law school shall establish learning outcomes that shall at a minimum include competency in the following. You can see the four major areas there. And when we think of outcomes, we sort of think of, okay, well, have our students graduated? Have our students been able to find jobs? And are they passing the bar exam? And certainly those are important outcomes, but when you look at Standard 302, it makes clear that there are other measurements and other important outcomes that must be achieved for those who actually enroll in the program of legal education. So we're simply not just interested in how many students graduate, how many students have jobs, and how many people pass the bar. It's more about what did our students learn and how can we improve that student learning. When we talk about 314, assessment of student learning, the law school shall utilize both formative and summative assessment methods in its curriculum to measure and improve student learning and provide meaningful feedback to students. What's interesting here is that the ABA have identified two major assessment methods, both formative and summative. And we'll talk about what both of those are, and specifically this webinar will talk about formative assessments, but I suggest that there's a third kind of assessment that really needs to be looked at closely, although it doesn't necessarily need to be in the standards, but it is something that law schools should really think about and implement. So the ABA standards sort of emphasize both formative and summative assessment. What's important here is that it talks about in its curriculum. So it's important to note that formative and summative assessments don't necessarily have to exist in every particular course. As long as there's formative and summative assessments throughout the curriculum, the standard, in my opinion, should be satisfied. And again, finally, to improve student learning. And again, the real crux, the real purpose of assessment is to improve student learning. The focus is really on the students. If we look at Interpretation 314-1 again, the ABA focuses on the two kinds of assessments that it identified in the standards, formative assessments, which are regular assessments throughout the semester that enables faculty to provide students with useful feedback on their progress, and also identifies ways where the students can improve their learning. Compare that with summative assessments, where it's generally given at the end of the course, and it basically measures what the student has learned over the course of the full semester or the full year. And the third kind of assessment, which is not identified in the standards, but I think it is important for law schools to incorporate into their program of legal education and throughout the curriculum, is, in my opinion, diagnostic assessments. I think diagnostic assessments are important. They're given at the beginning of the course or semester, and basically they help identify your students' current knowledge of the particular subject. It gives you an idea of where they are in a particular skill set or capability, and it can help clarify any misconceptions about a particular area of law or sub-area of law before the teaching actually takes place. And so knowing student strengths and weaknesses can actually help you better plan what to teach and how to teach it throughout the semester. And there you see different types of diagnostic assessments. You can have pre-tests before a particular area, and it can either be on substance, on the content, or something else. It can be self-assessments, having students sort of identify some of their strengths and weaknesses in a particular area or a particular skill set. And a diagnostic assessment doesn't even necessarily have to be a written test or assessment. It can certainly just be an interview. It can be a brief 10-minute interview with a particular student and really talking to the student informally about the student's strengths and weaknesses, and having the student sort of critically self-examine where the student may stand within a particular class, or what the student may know about a particular area. So I think diagnostic assessments are really important also when you're thinking about creating sort of a larger assessment program. But going back to the two specific kinds of assessments that are identified in Standard 314, let's talk about summative assessments. And we'll talk about this first just because this is an area that, as law faculty, that we're most accustomed with, just because, again, like I had said earlier, this is an area that we're most familiar with because of what we experienced in law school. And so when it comes to summative assessments, summative assessment is an evaluation to test a student's comprehension of course learning objectives. And law school is generally a final exam. And it's basically the mechanism to test the end product, the student's knowledge. And when you think of summative assessment, in a way, it provides an explanation for a particular grade. A student receives a course grade. How do you justify that course grade? Many times it's the performance on a final exam on this summative assessment. So grades are usually an outcome of summative assessments. And these summative assessments indicate whether the student has gained an acceptable level of knowledge gain, meaning is the student able to effectively progress to the next part of the class, to the next course in the curriculum, to the next level of understanding. So that's summative assessment. Generally speaking, for a law school context, historically, it's just a final exam. Some other examples of summative assessments include the following: final examinations. And it doesn't necessarily just have to be a final examination. A midterm exam could also be a summative assessment also, assessing sort of all the information that has been taught prior to the midterm exam. And especially if the final exam is not cumulative since the midterm exam, certainly it's more of a summative assessment as well. And you can see some of the other examples there. Term papers or seminar papers are kinds of summative assessments. Keeping in mind, though, if you require preliminary drafts to be submitted prior to the final term or seminar paper, then those drafts could be a form of formative assessment. So let's move on to formative assessments, and really the heart of this webinar. What are formative assessments specifically? Again, this is, I believe, a sort of a paraphrase definition from the interpretation by the ABA regular assessments throughout the semester that enable faculty to provide students with useful feedback on their progress and ways they can improve. And so formative assessments are different from summative assessments in that they're more frequent. Summative assessments are simply at the end, generally at the end of the semester, whereas formative assessments are given throughout the semester. They're regularly given. There are multiple assessments throughout the semester. And for the instructor, what that means is that the information generated from these formative assessments provides faculty members with an opportunity to either reinforce or alter future lessons or instructions to help students meet their learning objectives prior to the final assessment, prior to the summative assessment. And for the students, formative assessment helps them basically monitor their progress so that they can meet the course objectives, so that they can improve their student learning, so that they can actually perform better on the summative assessment. But when it comes to formative assessments, a critical component of the formative assessment process is that the instructor provides guidance on what the students can do to improve their performance in the future, which summative assessments don't provide. Once a summative assessment has occurred, it's too late for the student to improve on anything in that particular course. So that's the importance of giving formative assessments. It's giving students an opportunity to learn what they need to do so that they can actually make improvements to do better on the summative assessment. And so the important note here, when we're talking about formative assessments, the real big thing to understand with formative assessment is that the primary focus of it is to improve student learning. That's the whole purpose of formative assessment. And so it's important to note that formative assessments are going to be most effective if they're done frequently, so that the students have regular feedback and that the information used to assess the students are given to the students immediately, so that the students can have time to make any appropriate adjustments in their studying or in their preparation so that they can perform better, either on the summative assessments or some other project. Now, we've talked about what formative assessments are, but just as important is understanding what formative assessments are not. And I think it's important to understand that formative assessments aren't used to evaluate the professor. Now, I think this is important to understand, because we don't want to undermine an authentic assessment by having it thwarted by accountability or other competitive kinds of incentives that might be built into assessments if they're used to evaluate the professor. And so that's why it's important to view formative assessments as simply a way to improve student learning rather than a way to evaluate an individual professor's teaching. What else is formative assessment not? Well, it shouldn't be burdensome. And I think a lot of people, when they read these new standards, that they see a heck of a lot more work being thrown onto their plate. And as what's going to be discussed later, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And in fact, when you look at Interpretation 314-2, it makes clear that multiple assessment methods aren't required in every course. Again, when we're talking about assessments, the ABA requires formative and summative assessments throughout the curriculum, but not necessarily within each and every particular course. Now, granted, there might be some courses where multiple formative assessments and multiple formative assessment methods are required and are beneficial to have, but it certainly, at least the way I read the standard, does not require that. Formative assessments are also not always for student grading, which is different from summative assessments. Summative assessments, like I said, is generally a mechanism to grade students. Formative assessments generally is not always for student grading. Formative assessments can be graded or ungraded, and there's pros and cons on both sides. And in conducting my classes, I generally teach bar preparation classes, both an essay class and a multiple choice class, and I give both graded and ungraded assessments, and there's pros and cons to both. I mean, I think an ungraded assessment allows students to look at the assignment as sort of an opportunity to learn, as an opportunity to improve their learning, their writing abilities, their test-taking abilities, rather than evaluation. The problem, of course, if it's not graded, is that some students are not going to prioritize the assignment or assessment, and they're not going to properly prepare for an ungraded assignment, and therefore may skew the results of it. On the other hand, a graded assignment, while it might induce students to prepare, sometimes the stress or the permanent consequence of a grade may make the formative assessment less likely of a tool for student learning improvement. So, balancing these concerns, for graded assignments and ungraded assignments is certainly something that needs to sort of keep in mind. But in the grand scheme of things, it's important to know, again, to recap, as far as what formative assessments aren't. They aren't used to evaluate the professors. They aren't supposed to be burdensome, and they don't always have to be for a grade. So let's look at some benefits of formative assessments when it comes to faculty. Well, by offering formative assessments, and again, by offering regular formative assessments, faculty members are obviously able to provide regular feedback that can be applied immediately. So theoretically, you should be able to see sort of better performance by the students. It provides useful information about what students have learned without the large time commitment. The large time commitment that usually involved in preparing for tests, writing exams, reading papers, all of those things that generally make up the summative assessments. And finally, it helps foster good working relationships between students and professors. And I think by having regular formative assessments, really what you're doing is you're creating sort of a culture among the students that, hey, yeah, as law professors, we really do care about your success, and we are going to do whatever we can do to help you learn, to help you succeed, not only in your classes, but on the bar exam and further in your practice. So there are several benefits of formative assessments when it comes to faculty, and similarly, there's benefits to the students as well. It helps them develop self-assessment and learning management skills, and this is important because, like I said, not all formative assessments need to be graded. And so part of the formative assessment process is giving students an opportunity to understand where they might be deficient in a certain area. So there's more self-assessment, there's more self-awareness of what their deficiencies are, and hopefully how to improve those deficiencies. In larger classes, it can reduce the feelings of isolation, especially if it's a lecture type of class, by being able to offer formative assessments, which can easily be done in a large lecture class, where you're getting more student participation. So just being lost in a lecture room is less likely to occur. Formative assessments also help increase the understanding and ability to think critically about the course content. By having formative assessments, the students more regularly are forced to think about how the different concepts are sort of interweaved with one another. And hopefully they're just not looking at components of the law sort of in isolation of each other until they're required to sort of put the pieces together until the summative assessment. That last one, I think, is probably, in my opinion, because, again, my background is with preparing students for the bar exam. When it comes to formative assessments, I think the biggest benefit to the students is that it reduces procrastination and it fosters long-term retention. It reduces procrastination because it forces students to prepare for these formative assessments, whether they're graded or not. I think by having regular formative assessments, students are then going to be forced to review the materials more often and more frequently than they might if they know that the only time they're going to be assessed on the subject matter is in December or May. And because they're learning the information and because they're being assessed on the information more regularly, hopefully that will foster long-term retention of the information, because the more repetitive assessing of the information will hopefully make that information stick in their head a bit more. Now, what can formative assessments evaluate? And when you're creating formative assessments, it's really important to have a clear idea of what you want the formative assessment to do. You want it to evaluate sort of course-related knowledge, cognitive skills. What does the student know? Which includes prior knowledge, recall, and understanding. You want it to evaluate behavioral. How has that knowledge affected the student's behavior? Performance. What can the student do with that knowledge? And attitudinal. How has the knowledge or experience affected the student's attitude? What are some of their values and self-awareness as a result? Traditional types of formative assessments, and these are the kinds of assessment tools and methods that we've generally have, as law faculty incorporated in class, even though we may not have thought about these as formative assessment tools. These are certainly tools that are formative in class participation, whether you're doing it informally or more formally with the use of clicker technology. This is something that we do at our law school at Lincoln Memorial University Duncan School of Law, is that in every class we require the professors to offer 3 questions, whether multiple choice or other kinds of questions, in class using the clicker technology, and then we can go back and look at the individual student's performance on those questions based on the clicker technology. We also have quizzes, we have writing assignments, and like I said before, sometimes midterm examinations can be considered a form of formative assessment in addition to a summative assessment as well. More so as a formative assessment because students can understand why they missed questions on the midterm and be able to make corrections and improvements for the final examination. So a lot of those listed on the screen right now are things that aren't new. Again, maybe we don't think about those as formative assessments, but here are some other types of formative assessments that are common in other disciplines, but not as commonplace in a lot of law school courses. And this is just a sample, and this is taken from the Classroom Assessment Techniques, a Handbook for College Teachers by Angelo and Cross. And you can see there just other kinds of formative assessments that could be incorporated within a small or a large class that doesn't necessarily, A, take a lot of time to administer, and B, certainly wouldn't take a lot of time to review. And again, as you're reviewing the formative assessments, keeping in mind that formative assessments don't always have to be graded. So let's look at the 1-minute paper. Okay, sometimes what you may want to do is during the last few minutes of a class period, you can ask the students just to free write. Use the half sheet of paper and have them write down what they understood the best and what they understood the least. Then, obviously collect those papers after class and review them. And then for the next class period, you have a good idea of where some of the gaps and deficiencies might be. Muddiest point, and this is similar to what I just described for the 1-minute paper, but it only asks students to describe what they didn't understand. And it could also ask them, well, what do they need help with? So then again, in the next class period, you might be able to focus or alter your instruction to help with that aspect of the student learning. Chain notes. You can pass around a large envelope with a question about something you discussed in the class, and each student writes a short answer, puts it in the envelope, passes it around, and you can review that prior to the next class. Student-generated test questions. Okay? And this is something that I used to do a lot in the past when I was teaching my multiple choice test taking class for the bar exam, for the MBE. After we reviewed, say, a concept like hearsay, I would then have students create their own multiple choice question based on sort of the structure and organization of National Conference of Bar Examiners questions. I asked them to write their own MBE-like test questions and provide options, answer choices for the question as well, and to explain why the right answer is right and why the 3 options that they created are wrong. And I think that is a good assessment of really understanding what they know, and also it'll help them understand also, if they're unable to create some good options, what they might not know. Exam evaluations. So, sometimes what you can do is on an assessment, you can ask students to evaluate how well the test measures their knowledge or skills, and you can evaluate not only sort of your students' learning at that point, but also your teaching and test questions as well. Student rep groups. You can ask students to volunteer, to meet as a small group with you, and basically interview them and see what they're learning, ask them about suggestions for improving the course, And the last one there is peer review. So you can ask a fellow colleague, another faculty member, to sit down in your class and have the colleague assess, your teaching, the class. You can have the colleague give her or his impressions about the class, your interactions with the students, and everything else. And again, that's a way that can be used to help improve the student learning experience. So there's a lot of different kinds of formative assessments that can be used. And I think, the ABA guidance memo says it great. I mean, it says considerable space for schools to develop their own assessment schemes that fit their program and their culture, and flexibility is meant to permit schools to experiment to reflect the diversity law school's missions and programs. So while the ABA has indicated that schools must incorporate formative and summative assessments throughout the curriculum, they haven't really given, even in the guidance memo, they really haven't really given great guidance as to what kinds of formative assessments or summative assessments must be given. Now, I think, again, I think that's good, because that gives law faculty really a great opportunity to sort of think outside the box and to try, new things that may not have even been incorporated or tried in other disciplines where we might be looking at. Keeping in mind that, the parameters that we still need to follow is that each school is seriously measuring its success in meeting the outcomes that it has identified as appropriate to its mission, and that meaningful feedback is given. And again, meaningful feedback is really a part of formative assessment. So how can ExamSoft help with formative assessments? And so, one of the things that we wanted to do here, and we're a bit in a unique situation here just because we are a relatively new school. Our first class sat for the bar exam in July 2013. So most of the faculty here are relatively new. So the benefit that we had here is that we weren't set in our ways, and we were willing to try new things. And so we were able to sort of look at ExamSoft and use it in a way that most law schools really haven't used it. Although, again, it's been widely used in an assessment way in other disciplines for quite some time. Now, when it comes to law schools and ExamSoft, and I just learned today that this number is probably outdated. 80% of law schools use ExamSoft is what I have, and I learned today that number is actually probably 83 or 84%. So, a great majority of law school, and probably schools in general, use ExamSoft, but this is surprising too. Most simply use it as an exam-taking tool. I mean, most law schools simply use ExamSoft as a secure testing platform. But there's so much more that can be done with ExamSoft, and our school really wanted to take advantage of all of those features. We wanted to do it early on, knowing that these new standards were coming down the pipeline. So what we did was take advantage of the categorization features in ExamSoft. So what we did was, whenever we administer an assessment on ExamSoft, we categorize every single question. And when using rubrics as well, when grading writing assignments, each item in the rubric is also tagged to categories as well. And every multiple choice question, every item in a rubric is actually tied to 3 categories. They're tied to a programmatic learning outcome, which is institutionally developed. It's tied to also a course level outcome, which is developed by the individual professor teaching the course. And it's also tied to a subject matter outline. Generally, these subject matter outlines are keyed or basically modeled after the subject matter outlines produced by the National Conference of Bar Examiners, either for the MBE subjects or the multi-state essay exam subjects. So every test question is actually tagged to 3 different categories. And if we were to explore that a little bit more, and again, each question is tied to a programmatic learning outcome, a course level learning outcome, and a subject matter outline. If we were to look at the programmatic learning outcomes, the law school has identified 7 major areas of learning outcomes from a programmatic level: knowledge, critical thinking skills, research skills, communication skills, which is then broken up between oral skills and written skills, professional responsibility, ethics and diversity, and continued learning. And these somewhat mimic the outcomes that are now listed in Standard 302. When it comes to course level learning outcomes, and again, these are crafted by the individual professors, and this is a very small snippet of the categories for one of my classes that I taught last fall called Bar Exam Skills, BES. And so you can see I have an area for torts, and under torts, what I want students to know are intentional torts. And you don't see the children under intentional torts, but if you were to click on that plus sign, it would expand and identify the 7 different intentional torts. Similarly, one of my course learning objectives is that students know negligence. And by expanding that plus sign next to C-BES, Bar Exam Skills 02.02 negligence, you'll see the children under that with individual entries for duty, breach, causation, and damages. So I know by using these course level learning objectives categories, I know where the students are missing the mark. And it's much more important for me to know that they may not be understanding the differences between actual causation and proximate causation than simply just missing negligence. And that's one of the reasons why these course level learning outcomes or objectives are so detailed, just because, again, the whole purpose of formative assessments is to improve student learning and to provide, by providing students with detailed information, the students are going to be able to fine-tune their preparation for the final exam or ultimately the bar exam a bit better. So that's course level learning objectives. Finally, the subject matter outline. Every question is also tied back to a specific place in a subject matter outline. This is just an example of a subject matter outline for agency. And generally speaking, like I said, these subject matter outlines are keyed or resembles an outline produced and released by the National Conference of Bar Examiners, slightly modified based on what we feel should be emphasized in terms of what they need to know for success in law school and the bar exam. So when you look at these three different categories, what we're able to do is get some pretty good information that then we can relate to the students. So, we know by tagging all of the questions, we know sort of what potentially might be tested on the bar exam, or what potentially the National Conference of Bar Examiners has indicated what's important for a first-year attorney to know. By creating programmatic learning outcomes, we can identify areas that we think students should know, and by identifying the course level outcomes, we know exactly what's tested in a particular class, and what's tested in a particular class may or may not be consistent with everything that's in the subject matter outline, either because the professor or even the law school deems that information not important to cover in a particular course, or maybe that information is covered in a different course. But in the end, what we're talking about here, by tagging all of these questions, what we can do is identify certain things. So we know what specifically is being taught in each course, and we actually have like hard data that backs it up. We also know the areas where the students are strong and weak. And so using that information, we can adjust the curriculum appropriately, or we can emphasize different areas in other courses coming up in the students' law school careers to address those weak areas. We know what's not covered in the course and or the curriculum, and we also know what other courses may need to address a particular programmatic learning outcome. And so really by tagging all of our questions to programmatic learning outcomes, to course level learning outcomes, and subject matter outlines, it is a lot of work. I'm not going to lie. It is a lot of work on the front end. But the work on the front end provides so much more useful data, not only to the professor, but also to the students. Okay? And so when you think about it, we have 34 programmatic learning outcome tags, 440 course level learning outcome tags, and 753 subject matter outlines, and it's growing. But it's also, we sort of discuss whether it's a benefit or a burden to have all of these tags. And at least for the short term, I think it's more important to have more categories, because the information that we can use and give back to the students is very important to help them improve their student learning. So one of the most important reports that we give students after some of these formative assessments that's given through ExamSoft are these Strengths and Improvement Opportunities report. And so what we do, because we're tagging every single question, we're able to identify to the particular student where they're weak in. And this is an example of an assessment, a formative assessment that I gave in my bar exam skills class, which is a multiple choice MBE class that basically tests certain areas within each of the 7 or the 8 MBE subjects, depending if you separate crim law and criminal procedure. And so the overall percentage, in my opinion, is a bit meaningless. In my opinion, doesn't really tell me much that a student scores 63% when the class average is 59%. That overall average doesn't really tell me where the student is deficient, and it really doesn't help the student with their student learning, because they don't know exactly where to focus on. And so what we've done by breaking down these categories to granular levels that we have, we can actually identify and pinpoint the specific areas where the students need to particularly focus on. So if we blow this up a bit, you can see that if we look at constitutional law, the student scored 63%, whereas the average was 61%. And again, you know, in my opinion, I still don't know if that's good enough for the individual student to know in order to improve his or her learning. So that's broken down even more to due process and equal protection and First Amendment freedom. So if we go back a slide, we know that the student was only 63% overall in constitutional law, but we know that the student did really, really well basically on the 14th Amendment, due process and equal protection, 91%. Where the student was having trouble and which brought the overall average for constitutional law down was First Amendment freedoms, which is 44%, whereas the class average was 60%. But even that doesn't really tell me much because there's different areas within First Amendment. So we blow that up a little bit more, and we divide that up into religion and speech. And really what this tells us is that while the student knows the 14th or 5th Amendment much more so than the First Amendment, at least the student is generally weak across the board in the First Amendment when it comes to both freedom of religion and freedom of speech. And so, you know, we do a lot of these formative assessments, not only in my bar exam skills class, but in a lot of other doctrinal classes. And what we do ultimately is run longitudinal reports where we're able to sort of aggregate a lot of these data and send out letters or memos or notices to students, to giving them an idea of where they might stand in terms of being on track to passing the bar exam. And again, because we give this information to students early on, you can see the date here, January 7th, there's plenty of time for the students, you know, if you were to view the bar exam as the ultimate summative assessment, there's plenty of time for the students to use this information, the assessment data, to improve their learning, to adjust their preparation, whether it be for a particular final exam or ultimately the bar exam. And so, like I said, we're a relatively new school. I think we've been successful with giving students information on where they stand in terms of their learning. And so on the July 2013 Tennessee bar exam, again, this is the first opportunity that our inaugural class who graduated in May 13 had to take the bar exam. So for that administration, our students passed at an 81% first-time bar passage rate, which was slightly below the state average, but still nonetheless good considering that was our first class taking the exam. Our second large class, July 2014, we dropped a few percentage points, but as many of y'all know, the bar passage rate, the first-time bar passage rates across the country fell dramatically and significantly for July 14. And so while we were at 81% in July 13, but below the state average, we were actually 77% for the next administration in 2014, but that represented almost a 5% improvement over the statewide first-time bar pass average. How we're going to do on July 2015, the exam is next week, and so the results likely won't come out till middle of October. So what to do, redo, rethink? Well, creating, one of the things that we need to sort of think about is creating measurable and manageable learning outcomes. Again, the assessments is really the starting point of creating these learning outcomes. But in order for the assessments to really be solid, we may have to think about how we identify and break down and divide some of these learning outcomes. Getting the faculty buy-in. And again, we are in a unique situation in that we're a relatively new law school where assessment was emphasized basically from day one. So we had buy-in from the very beginning. For some of the more established institutions and for some of the more established faculty, it might be a little bit more difficult to get their buy-in. But I think it might be easier to do that if you emphasize that these formative assessments aren't being used to assess them. Again, it's all about improving student learning. We need to develop a culture of assessment throughout the curriculum for both the faculty and the students. And really, we need to be able to give the results of these assessments to students more often, I think. And so in the past, sometimes, like I said, we just did assessments for the sake of assessments. But if there's transparency and if they understand what these assessments are being used for to help them with their student learning, then they'll be more open to doing the assessment. The last thing you want to hear from a student is, oh, not another assessment. They should actually look forward to doing assessments. We need to be able to ensure that we're tagging our questions appropriately. Just because the assessment reports and the strengths and opportunity reports that we give out to students are only going to be as good and accurate as the taggings are. We need to be able to assess the assessments. We need to be able to critically examine whether the assessments that we're using are actually good assessments used to actually assess student learning. And you can see the other two over there. So we've had success using ExamSoft and formative assessments, and again, it's a slow-moving process, though. But I think we're moving in the right direction. I think the ABA is moving in the right direction, and I think this is going to do incredible things to the program at legal education and law school instruction generally. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that might be submitted.
Wonderful. Thank you.